So in this lecture, we're going to learn how we can actually create shadows using CSS. And in order to demonstrate how shadows work in CSS, what we're going to do is to add a shadow to each of these cards here. And remember that that is one of the common uses of shadows. So to add a medium-sized shadow to a product card like these ones here, right? Now, adding shadows in CSS is actually quite simple. All we need to do is to use the box shadow property. So in order to add shadow to a box, then remember how I said that we can also add shadows to text, but a bit more about that later. But anyway, the box shadow property actually requires multiple values here. We can specify 4 or 5 values, and the first one is basically the horizontal offset of the shadow. So here in the first value, we can specify a length, which will then be the horizontal offset between the box and the shadow. So let's just try 20 pixels here. Then the second value is the same, but for the vertical direction. So basically the offset of the shadow from the box in this direction here. So let's also use 20 pixels. And for now, I'm just putting any values here. And later I will then explain how we can create small and medium and large shadows by tweaking these values. All right. Next up, the third value is the blur of the shadow. So if we use a small value, it will be almost not blurred. And if we use a very large one, then of course the blur will be huge. So again, I'm using 20 pixels here, and we will then tweak these as we go. Then value number 4 is actually optional, but what it allows us to do is to basically scale the shadow up. So let's use, let's say 10 here. All right. But remember that this one is optional, and if we don't specify it, it will simply be 0. Then the last one is the color of the shadow. And here let's just for now use black, which will look terrible, but this is just to fill it up with some values. So if we give it a save, then, well, we get a huge black and terribly looking shadow. Now, actually, we want this shadow not to be just on this part, but on the entire card. So let's see if there's a class on that. And it is. So the chair class. So here, and yeah, doesn't matter. I think all of them will have the chair class. And what I'm also noticing here is that each of them is actually a figure element. And the figure element, I think I hadn't described before, but basically it's a common element that we use for a product card like this. But we could also have used the article HTML element, such as we used in the coding challenges of the previous section. Remember that? So there we had a shoe, which was also kind of an article like these ones here. And so there we used the article element. So again, we could have used that here as well, but figure is also kind of a standard for displaying any card like these ones. But anyway, let's now go back, select the chair class here, and move our shadow there. Nice. Or maybe not so nice, because we now need to fix that first problem, which is that the shadow is very dark, which makes it look very unnatural. Now, remember from way back how we learned that when we want to display a color with some opacity, we usually use the RGBA notation for that, right? So we can easily convert that by hovering over this color. And then here in the color picker, we just need to keep clicking on this title. One more time. Yeah, so now we have RGB, and if we then change the slider, it will add the A here and the fourth value, which is for the opacity. Now, usually for a shadow, we use a very low value, something like 0.1 max. So this is the shadow that you get in that situation. However, to demonstrate all the other values, let's put it back at a high value so that we can actually see the shadow when we manipulate the rest of the values. So usually in user interface design, we want the light source to basically come from the top. So basically from here, shining down on the element basically from here. So what that means is that the shadow cannot be like it is right now, because having a shadow that goes the same amount to the bottom and right kind of means that the light source is here shining in this direction where I'm moving the mouse, right? So that's quite intuitive, I think. And so, but if we want the light source to be here at the top, so in this direction, then we do not want any offset here to this side. And so usually we do set this value here to 0. All right. And so I think that this looks a lot more natural right now. Then the other value actually looks okay. So the vertical offset. So for a medium-sized shadow, that is a reasonable amount. Then this one here, remember, is the blur. And for example, let's set it to something smaller just to see. And at the extreme, if it was 0, then the shadow would be completely a box. So just like this. All right. However, you see that the box, so this shadow is bigger than the original box itself. And so the reason for that is this value number 4, which remember is the radius, which remember is basically a value to scale the box shadow up. So usually I actually leave this at 0, and so then it will look like this. So right now the shadow is only here behind the box and then coming out a little bit here because of these 20 pixels. And if we increase those, then this part here, of course, becomes bigger. Right? So I usually leave this here at 0, which is the same as leaving it out completely. But I will just leave it here so that you know for reference that there are 5 possible values. So of course, this now doesn't look at all like a shadow. So let's add back some blur here. So at 10, for example, it would look like this, which still looks quite unnatural. And well, this makes it a bit better, but still we can go bigger, like 30 pixels. And so, well, in my opinion at least, that looks a lot better. We could go even bigger, but then the shadows would start to overlap each other here. And so let's not go there. Okay, so if we now decrease this value here, it will start to look quite natural, which is always what we need to strive for when we design a shadow here in CSS. Okay, so this now looks like a nice and clean and especially natural looking shadow. And it does the job well of highlighting these cards here just a little bit, but without adding too much visual clutter to our page. And I think we can actually go a little bit lower even. So what happens if we give it 5%? Then it becomes even subtler, but it is still enough that we basically get this border here. So without the shadow, this was simply all white, which we can see by doing this, right? But as we start adding some more shadow, then of course that starts to create a separation between the element itself and the background. So of course that's 0.5, and maybe that's a little bit too little. Let's put it at 7. So this is basically a 7% opacity. And so this is a value that I like to use in these situations. And this looks quite nice. And hopefully with this, you learned how this box shadow property actually works. Now, this kind of property, which requires so many values, is actually a good candidate to look it up on the MDN documentation. So MDN box shadow, if you're interested in learning more about this particular property. There's also a lot of examples, for example, for creating that kind of glow that I mentioned before. So of course the shadow doesn't have to be some kind of gray, so like a variation of black, but you can use a color to create this kind of glowing effect there. And you can move the shadow around, of course. using even negative values here. And yeah, you can even actually add multiple shadows as we have on this element by adding a comma here. Right, you can also read about all of them, but we're not going to do that. But this is exactly what the documentation is for. And now just to finish, let me very quickly also show you how we can use shadows on text. So I will just copy this because it's very similar. And let's just do it here on our H1 element. So instead of being called box shadow, it's called text shadow. And this one doesn't have this fourth value of the spread. So it's just like this. Let's add some more here just to see the effect. And there we go. Now this is a lot of blur. That's why we cannot really see it. So here the values need to be a lot smaller. And now you can see it, right? So something like this might be possible. And so in this situation, of course, this doesn't look really good. But actually text shadow is quite useful for situations where you have text on top of an image. So that's something I didn't discuss when we talked about image, but that would be yet another technique of handling text on top of images. All right, but let's turn it off because that looks kind of crazy. And so, yeah, that's it for working with shadows in CSS. Hope that made sense and that it was fun to keep adding some real world effects that you see on other pages that you visit every single day. And next up, we're going to talk about border radius, which is yet another one of those a little bit more modern CSS properties that we use in the... Moving on in our design section, our next topic is about border radius and roundness in general. Now, it might seem that border radius is a pretty insignificant detail. However, actually, it is pretty important because the amount of border radius that we give to our elements has a big effect on the seriousness or playfulness of any design. So, as I already hinted at here at the very beginning, we can use border radius to basically increase the playfulness and fun of the design by making it at the same time less serious. So here is what I just said. So the less border radius we have, the more serious or elegant a design can be perceived. On the other hand, if we add a lot of border radius to our elements, then that design will automatically look more playful and more fun. And so I think that you can agree with the fact that this design on the right side looks a lot more playful and a lot less serious than the one on the left side. Now, of course, there are also other factors that play into that perception, like the typography and the colors that are used on the left side. But nonetheless, border radius is still a very important ingredient that we can use to make any design look less serious, or on the other hand, if we simply don't use it, we can make a design look more serious or more elegant. Now, in order to actually choose the amount of border radius, a good indicator of that is the typeface. So the typeface that you choose will already have a certain roundness. And so you can kind of make the border radius match that roundness. For example, in this design right here, the typeface is pretty round. And so we have those rounded corners on the image. We have the button also completely round, actually. And then we even have those icons wrapped inside of circles. And by doing that, the designer here really added a lot of roundness to the overall design, not just in the typeface, but also in these other design elements. And therefore, that takes away a lot of the elegance and makes this all a little bit more playful and more inviting at the end of the day as well. Now, on the other hand, we have this very boxy typeface, which is actually also inter, so the one that we used in our current very small project. And so in this example, the designer added just a tiny bit of border radius to these buttons in order to still add a little bit of playfulness to the design. Now next up, let's talk about where we can actually use border radius. And the first elements that use border radius the most, I would say, are buttons. And on buttons, we have the option of adding only a small amount of border radius, just enough to kind of take away the hard edges there. Or on the other hand, we can make the buttons completely round, like these first three here. Or we can even use some creativity and make only some of the corners round and leaving the other ones with their sharp edge. Now another great candidate are images. So it's pretty common to use border radius on images like we see here. And if we take that to the extreme, we can make them also completely round like we have it here in the center. Then around icons is also pretty common. And here again, we have those two options of only making them slightly round, so taking off the edge there, basically. And then, like I also showed you before, we can make the icons completely enclosed inside of a circle. Next, border radius is also used on some sections that we want to stand out, so a little bit like a shadow as well. And finally, also some other kind of random elements can always use some border radius. So here are just a couple of more elements that I found when researching the course that use some border radius in some form or another. And so I hope that these examples can help you to find some inspiration, along of course with all the other ones that I showed you in this lecture. And that's actually already enough for this lecture. So in the next one, we will now learn how to actually apply border radius using CSS. And specifying border radius in CSS is actually extremely easy. And so let's now go do that. So all we need to do is to specify the border radius property on some element. So let's go, for example, to images and apply a border radius to all of them. So I'm actually going to select right here all the images and then border radius. And so here, of course, we need to specify a length. And let's just experiment with different values just so you get a sense for how much border radius corresponds to a certain amount of pixels. Like if we say 2 pixels, then almost nothing is going to change. So you see that here, it is still almost completely squared. Now, if we use like 50 pixels, then that will actually take away a lot of the corner here, right? So that is 50 pixels, but now let's use something more sensitive like 12 pixels. And so this looks a little bit nicer, also because our typeface is actually quite boxy, so quite squared. And so maybe we wouldn't even need any border radius at all in this design, but of course I still want to show it to you. And so yeah, this project is mainly about actually showing you stuff. So this images here has now 12 pixels, and this one, and this one. And so since we're already here, let's now give this entire section here a border radius as well. So we have it here on the image, 12 pixels. And so to make this look nice, we should give this section here the exact same amount of border radius. So remember, that is 12 pixels. So border radius. So if we added something else, like 20 pixels, then that would look kind of off. Well, actually with 20 it wouldn't be so bad, but let's say 30. So now it looks weird because this radius here is really a lot bigger. And so that's why we make it the same also at 12 pixels. So you see that? Now it looks quite consistent. And let's do the same here, since we're already down here as well with these cards. So that is the chair box. Probably it's the chair actually. So border radius of 12 pixel. And you see it down here, we have that border radius. However, now this looks kind of strange here because we have the border radius not only on the card here, but we also have it in these two corners of the image, right? So we want it here in the top, but not at the bottom. And so we can actually control individual corners also using CSS. So let's basically take away the border radius here in this corner and in this one. So let's select the chair and then the image that's inside of that. So we're using a child selector, again, selecting the chair element, which is all of this, and then in there the image, which is this element here. So remember that the image itself has a border radius of 12. And now we can selectively turn off one corner. So bottom and then left radius. And let's set it to 0. And it's gone. Right? And so this is actually how you would also style a button, like those creative buttons that I showed you in the last lecture. So where one corner looks like this, completely squared, and then the other 3 ones are round. But here that's not what we're looking for. We also want the other one to be 0. So just like this, right? So that looks nice and round. And now all we need to fix is these buttons. So this one and this one. And what we want to do with these is to actually make them completely round. So basically like this here. So where is that? Yeah, right here. So border radius. So again, here we don't want this, which of course would still not look bad. But now I want to show you how we can actually make this really rounded. Now there are 2 ways of doing this, but one only works if the element is a square. So if the element is a square, to make it round, we give it a border radius of 50%, like this. However, since this is not a square, it will then turn this into this like oval, and so that is not what we want. And so instead, in a situation like this, what we need to do is to simply specify a really big value here. So as long as it's taller than the element is tall, we will be fine. So we can, for example, use 100 pixels. And so now that's the result. But we could also have used like 1000 pixels and that wouldn't change anything. It just cannot be less than the height. So like this, it wouldn't work. Like this, now maybe we're already there, but to play it safe, I like to use a really big value here. So that should have fixed it here and also down there, since that is using the same class of button. All right, so this nice little design is starting to look really great, I think. Now, one thing that we still need to fix is all the spacing that we have here on the page. So there's not enough white space here, which really makes it that there is a lack of visual hierarchy also on the page. And so that's what we're going to learn about in the next 2 videos, so that then we can come back and fix that here in. Welcome to the topic of white space. Now, white space is technically invisible, but it's still actually one of the easiest and fastest ways of drastically improving your designs. So let's now go ahead and learn how to do that. So white space is basically simply space between elements, but the right amount of white space can make our designs look clean, modern, and polished, and even more important, easy for the user to understand. Just look at this design, which has very little to no white space at all. So the entire content here looks very cramped, and it doesn't look clean at all, and our eyes do not really know how to navigate this page due to the lack of all this space. However, fortunately, it is very easy to fix this simply by adding some white space to the design. So now it does look quite modern and polished, and we can feel that somehow the design has some space to breathe. So this is in fact a dramatic improvement over the first version on the left side. But why exactly is white space so important? Well, white space automatically communicates how the different pieces of information in our layout are related to one another. And so by doing this, white space creates invisible relationships between the elements of the layout, which automatically makes it easy for the user to navigate that layout completely intuitively. Okay, and so now that we know what white space is and why it's so important, let's quickly learn how to use it. So, first of all, we should use a ton of white space between our sections. And going back to our previous example here, we can see that the designer did indeed add a lot of white space between these sections. So 192 pixels is a lot of space, but it is actually not too much. I think it does look quite right like this. And the same in this other design example here, where again there is a lot of white space between the sections. In this case, it's just 140 and 160 pixels, but of course, this will depend on many different aspects. You cannot just fix a number and then use that value of white space in all of your designs. Okay. Now, the next place where you need to use white space is between groups of elements. So use a lot of white space there as well, but of course, not as much white space as between sections. So here, for example, we have these different groups of elements, which we can clearly outline. And so between these, there is some white space, of course. And it is not little white space. So we have 96 there between the heading and then that first block of content. And then there is 152 pixels between these two rows. So it looks like it's a lot of space, but again, this is actually exactly the space that is needed to make this look clean and polished. And going now to our other example, here again, we can easily see the different pieces of content. So like these groups of elements where there are 24 pixels between all of them. So a little bit less here, but of course, once again, this will depend on many different factors. Now we usually focus more on vertical white space, but it's important to also think about horizontal white space, for example, like between these columns here. So usually vertically we need a lot more space than horizontally as a general guideline. All right. Now here I actually have another example, which is this one. And again, we can easily distinguish between the different groups of elements. And so of course, there has got to be some white space between them. And the same here in this other example. So again, two groups of elements here, and then we need to separate them visually simply by adding some white space in the form of margin, for example, in CSS. Now, next up, of course, we also need white space simply between the smaller elements. So going back here to all our three previous examples, you have some white space here, as you can see by these arrows. Then also a lot of white space visible in this example. And finally, it's also easy to see here in this final one. And once you're aware of this, you will start seeing this white space on every well-designed website that you visit. So it's something that every website that has a decent design will use a lot. Now, another guideline that I can give you is that inside of groups of elements, you should always try to use white space instead of lines. So using lines might look something like this, and this is actually a mistake that many beginner designers tend to make. So they think that in order to basically distinguish between elements, they need to add some visual lines. So just like in this example, while actually it looks way better and way more modern and more clean to simply add some space between the elements, right? So here you can still clearly see which elements belong together, but all without using these ugly looking lines. And so if you're trying to create a modern looking design, then this is always the way to go. Okay, so now you know where you should actually use white space, but how much should you use? Well, let's find out with some more guidelines here. So basically, elements that belong together should be closer together in our interface, so have less spacing between them, because that will distinguish them from other surrounding elements or groups of elements. And what I just described actually has something like an official name, which is the law of proximity. All right. Now, on the other hand, of course, if elements are not closely related to one another, then they should be further apart, so that a user intuitively perceives that a certain element or groups of elements are unrelated to another group of elements. So again, all of this is the law of proximity, and this should be the guiding principle when you define how much white space you're going to use between elements or groups of elements. So of course there are some examples here, and here we have way too little white space. So this is all packed together very closely, and the relationship between these elements is not really visible. But on the other hand, here it is much better. So the title and the text kind of belong together, and so the spacing between them is a lot less than the space that's between the icon and the title. And so this is the law of proximity in action. Now another example is this form right here, which has some ambiguous spacing. So here on the left side, these text labels are kind of in between two input fields, right? And so like this, the user has a hard time of knowing which input field actually each label belongs to. However, if we remove the white space and place the label close to the input field that it actually belongs to, we can remove that ambiguity and therefore help the user navigate this contact form. And since this is so important, let's check out another example right here. So on the left side, it doesn't really make sense why this Learn More button is so far away from that text that it is actually about. So for some reason it's closer to those links down there at the bottom, but again, that doesn't make much sense. And so why should that button be closer to that and not be closer to the text that it's actually about? And so fixing that is very simple, like we did here on the right side. So now the Learn More button is closer to what it belongs to. And so like this, it looks more natural and makes it all easier to understand. Now, next up, there is a guideline that many beginners find helpful when designing white space, which is basically to start with too much white space and then from there remove some space until it looks right. And again, of course, by doing that, we need to have the guiding principle of the law of proximity, and we also need to be aware that too much white space looks detached, while having too little white space, of course, makes the design look cramped. So here in this example, we actually tried that, and so we added way too much space, and actually right now everything looks kind of detached. So this is not good. And so in order to fix that, let's say that we actually removed most of the white space, but then it looked way too cramped, and we can also say that it even looks uninviting to read this text in the first place. So it looks like just a wall of text, which many times users do not like to read. But then after experimenting around a little bit and adding back some of the white space, we may end up with a result like this, which looks just right. So here we can feel that the design can breathe and everything is not too detached, but also not too cramped. So like this, it's perfect. And next, another guideline that might help you choose just the right amount of white space for your design is that you should try to match all the other design choices when it comes to white space. So for example, if you have big text or big icons, for example, then you will need more white space. So just like in this first example, here the text is huge, and so we see there is actually a lot of blank space here on this page, and also between the groups of elements, there is quite some white space there. Now, if you compare this to the design on the right side, here the text and the images are all quite small, and so therefore there is also a lot less space. So it would certainly look kind of unnatural if with this small content you would add a lot of white space between them. That just wouldn't feel right. Okay? And so again, you need to a little bit try to adjust your white space to all the other design choices that you already took. And now finally, when it comes to actually choosing the values for your white space in CSS, you can try to follow a hard rule just like we have been doing with the font sizes. Now, of course, you should not use the same rule as we used in typography, because that one is specially adapted for text. But instead, you can use a rule like this one, which only uses multiples of 16 pixels for all the margins and paddings that we apply on a page. Now, you will also need to add some smaller values like 2 and 4 and 8 and 12 pixels, but in general, from there on, all the other values are multiples of 16 pixels, and some of them are even skipped just in order to limit your choices. So it's the same idea as before with the font sizes, where I mentioned that limiting your choices is actually a good idea. So it sounds like a limitation, but it's actually great, because having to constantly think about what spacing we want to use can be really tiring. But if we have a system like this in place, then we can just choose a value, and if that one doesn't fit, then we go for the next one. And this one, believe me, will be even easier to use than the one for font sizes. So this makes designing much easier and faster, especially for beginners. And so we will use exactly this rule in our big project, and actually also in the one that we are doing in this section. However, before we go doing that, we will have another lecture in which we're going to talk about visual hierarchy. And so let's move there. In this lecture, we bring together many of the things that we have learned so far in this section in order to create something that we call visual hierarchy. So let's see what visual hierarchy is all about. And essentially, visual hierarchy is all about establishing which elements of a certain design are the most important ones. So that's exactly what hierarchy means, right? So essentially, we need to establish a hierarchy of elements in order to draw attention to the most important ones of these elements. And doing this is actually one of the best ways to make a layout actually look designed. So oftentimes an interface looks way more pleasing simply because the visual hierarchy is very well thought out and conveyed to the user. But before moving on, let's quickly look at an example here. Now, even without having learned anything about visual hierarchy, we can kind of intuitively see that the photos in the top and the booking box draw the most attention on this page, right? And so, again, establishing visual hierarchy is basically giving more prominence to these more important elements. And the reason why it is this way is that the visual hierarchy has been correctly established by a combination of position, colors, shadow, border, and other elements. And so that's why I also said that this lecture is basically going to be a culmination of everything that we have learned before. But anyway, moving on a little bit, visual hierarchy is also about defining a path for our users in order to guide them through the page in an intuitive and kind of automatic way. So imagine that a user enters this page. The attention will probably immediately fall on this big block of images here. Then, after that, the attention will go to this other important element, such as we had highlighted before, right? Then from there, it might go to this button because of the very bright color, and only then the attention of the user might jump here to the center part. So to the top probably of this part, and then here going down a little bit further, reading all this text, and only then in the very end, the attention might jump finally to this very small element that is here at the very bottom and with a small text. So as I had briefly mentioned already, what we do in order to establish a meaningful visual hierarchy is to use a combination of position, size, colors, spacing, borders, and shadows. And so the goal of this lecture is basically to show you how you can do exactly that. So establishing a good visual hierarchy between elements and components. Now, just as another example, imagine that we didn't have borders and shadows in this example. So then it would look like this, and all of a sudden the flow that we had before would be kind of lost. So the user maybe wouldn't really know anymore where to look after scanning the images. However, we do want our user to go to that reserve box, and so that's why this element was before featured so prominently. But anyway, we can even take it one step further by even removing the color from this component. And so now the visual hierarchy is completely lost, and the interface all of a sudden doesn't look so well designed anymore, right? So just 2 or 3 simple changes that we did here, and suddenly the design has a completely different look and feel. But of course, we want to avoid that when creating our own designs. And so let's now go learn how. So starting with the very fundamentals, the first guideline that I have for you is that you should position important elements closer to the top of the page, because that is where they get the most attention. So people usually read a page from top to bottom. And so therefore, elements that appear first on a page, so closer to the top, will naturally get more attention. Now, of course, there are many other factors involved in drawing attention, so not just the position related to the top of the page, but in general, attention flows from the top to bottom, so basically just like a river. And that applies to the overall page, but also to individual components. So in this example here, the first thing that the user might maybe notice is that logo there, then the navigation, and then immediately it will go for this main heading here. And so since this is the most important heading, it should be as close as possible to the top of the page. Then from there, attention will of course keep flowing down. And here we also see that we have this really important call to action button. And so your very first call to action button should also be as close as possible to the top of the page. Now, next up, it's important to be aware of the fact that images draw a lot of attention. And so therefore, you need to use them mindfully. So in this small component, the attention will probably immediately fall on the image and only then go here to this heading and then to the button. And so if we really wanted our user to read the text, then maybe we should consider not using the image at all or making a smaller image, because smaller images draw a little bit less attention. Then the next one here is from Instagram, where probably this first profile picture draws the most attention, and then from there it will immediately go down here to these images, and maybe then from there the attention might flow back up to these other information like followers, description, and so on and so forth. Another way to emphasize elements or groups of elements is to use white space strategically. So as we learned before, white space creates separation between elements or groups of elements, and so therefore it is also extremely important in order to correctly define a visual hierarchy. So for example, in these 2 designs, they have a lot of white space around this most important part of this page. So on the left especially, there is a ton of white space basically around this sign up form, while on the right side there is a huge amount of white space between the 2 rows and also really around these 5 feature blocks. Now, I don't mean, of course, that you should always surround everything with this much white space. Just follow the rules that we learned previously about white space and you're going to be fine. The point here is just that we can use white space strategically in order to make important elements stand out. Okay, and now we're going to start focusing only on text elements. So learning how and when we can make different text elements more or less prominent, because this is actually one of the most important things of doing visual hierarchy on a smaller level. So for example, inside of a component. So for text elements, we can use a combination of font size, font weight, color, and white space to give elements different levels of importance. And by color, I mean both text color and background color, like for example on buttons. And let's study again the example from the beginning. So this one here. And so at the very beginning, we have no hierarchy at all. All the text has the same size, the same weight and color. Only a little bit of white space has already been added. Now, as a first step of improving this, we can increase the font size a little bit on the title, which is the most important piece of content here. Next up, we can increase the font weight, for example, on the location, the heading again, and also the rating of 5.0. So this is looking quite nice already. There is definitely a lot more visual hierarchy than before, but we can even make this better to make it perfect. So basically, the final step is to lighten some of the colors in order to give them a little bit less importance. So here, the superhost label, the location, and also the number of ratings has actually been lightened in order to give them less prominence than the rest of the content. And let's check out another example here, which is this one, where at the beginning all the text is at 20 pixels and there is no hierarchy at all. There's no white space, no color, no font weight, and really nothing. So in order to improve this, we can change the font sizes a little bit and add some white space. So now there are a lot of different font sizes here according to the importance of each of the elements. So already looking a lot better, but to make it perfect, we can also add some font weight and some color. So what we did here was to emphasize some of these elements by making them bold. Then we added also some color to emphasize this link. And finally, we once again made some less important text a little bit lighter. And so with this, it becomes de-emphasized, which is a technique that we use all the time to build a nice visual hierarchy like this one. So the content is the same, but compare the left with the right design. It's really all about using these techniques in order to establish a visual hierarchy. Nothing more and nothing less than that. And all of a sudden, it looks really well designed, doesn't it? And since this is so important, let's look at a couple of other examples, but this time analyzing only the flow. So here it's probably again the image who is going to draw the most attention, and only then our eyes are going to move to that headline here, and followed then by this colored button here in the bottom. So this has this eye-catching background color, and therefore it draws a lot more attention than the text that is between the headline and this button. Then we might look at the price and the other pieces of content that are here. Now, of course, these flows will be different for different people, but I'm just describing what I think makes more sense for the average user. Then another example of a well-designed visual hierarchy is this one, where again we start at the very top, but then our bright blue button here in the bottom will draw our attention. From there, we might move to this bold text here. So again, the font weight is used here in order to draw attention, right? And only then, in the end, we might go to this de-emphasized text, which is a bit lighter and also has less font weight. Then another one where we have a more classical top to bottom flow. However, that small and light subtitle that says work 03 is not really drawing any attention because it's so light and so thin and small. So that's why we skipped it, because I think that many users will actually skip that and jump straight into the headline with their attention. Now here then we have this nice and subtle background color, which makes this piece of content stand out a little bit. So otherwise maybe the attention would immediately go to that image, but like this, maybe we will first stop here, and then after that we might look at the image and then the rest of the content here. Finally, just another one, and well, here we just start here with this really big text. Then probably we might go to this text that is a little bit smaller. And then here we have this bright color, which I think draws a lot of attention. And so I think the attention might jump there next. And only then we go to this small text, followed by this other even smaller text that's right here at the bottom. So here in this example, once again, you can really start seeing now why designers took the decisions that they did with the size, weight, color, and also white space. So all these components are really well designed, and therefore the visual hierarchy is also top-notch. And so again, nothing here is random. All the design decisions make sense because the designer wanted to establish a visual hierarchy to guide the user. But now you might ask, what elements should we actually emphasize? Well, we should emphasize contents like titles, subtitles, links, buttons, data points, and icons. And as we already saw in all the previous examples, we can also de-emphasize less important text, so things like labels or simply secondary information. So again, that example that we worked on previously, here we have the title, which is really emphasized. We have an icon, which is emphasized by the color. Then we have a really important data point, which is this rating, and that's why it is bold. Here is a link. And finally, there is some less important text here, so some additional information that on purpose we made lighter in order to de-emphasize it. All right. So these are basically the types of text that are important to think about when we create visual hierarchy. And let's take a look at a couple of more examples. So again, icon, subtitle, and link. And here we have subtitle and the title and the icon. And also the subtitle here. And I'm going through these examples a lot faster now because, as I mentioned before, I actually want you to download these lectures as PDF slides so that you can then study them on your own and get a lot of inspiration for when you start building your own designs. So you shouldn't just watch this video and call it a day. It's very important to also really analyze all of these examples one by one, because I did choose them very, very carefully with tens or probably hundreds of hours of research. All right. But anyway, let's take a look at a couple more. So here again, we have a subtitle and a couple of very important data points. So in this case, that's prices. And so therefore, they are bold and bigger than the rest of the text. And I think they're even darker. Then here we also have some additional information once again. So just telling customers that this is for European cards. And therefore this text is a lot lighter and also smaller. Then here these icons are apparently quite important, which is why they got this nice attention-grabbing color. And then finally there is this very subtle button. So a button with a very subtle background color. Because if this was, for example, green, like the rest of the text here, then that button would get all the attention. But in this case, apparently, the designers wanted the focus to be on the prices and not on the button. And so that's why they basically took out the green background color and replaced it with this very subtle gray. Now, another one, here are some icons, some important data points, and then this label here is very nicely de-emphasized by being super small, but still with this uppercase text, which I think looks amazing actually. Then here, again on Instagram, there is a data point, and then these buttons here are actually really noticeable, de-emphasized. And the reason for that is that Instagram doesn't want to take any attention away from the photos. All right. That's also why the mobile application is completely white, basically, except of course for all the pictures. All right, so that was a lot to take in about visual hierarchy for text elements, but we're not done yet, because now we need to talk about visual hierarchy between components. So that's also super important. And by components, essentially I mean groups of elements or big areas of content. So let's focus now on establishing visual hierarchy between components. And the way we do that is through a combination of background colors, shadows, and border. So let's take a look at an example. And so here in this design, this really bright background color really makes this section completely stand out from the rest of the page, right? And the same is true here on this website. So again, one big standout section which is going to take all the attention right here. And of course, that is on purpose. So that's why they chose this color right here, because that is where they want the user's attention to go. And this second one actually not only uses background color, but also a nice shadow. You see that? Then this one here also uses shadow, and it uses border as well. So border and shadow, but no background color, while this next one uses once again exclusively background color to highlight this most important row of this table. Now, another common technique of emphasizing a component A over a component B is by simply de-emphasizing the component B. So let's say right here we have component A and B, and we want to have component A stand out more. So we could of course add maybe a border or a shadow to the left one, so to component A, but what we can also do is to simply de-emphasize component B. So it lost its background color, and now component A has been made more prominent by simply removing that background color from component B. And by the way, notice also that arrow that says free close to the Start Now button. So that is yet another way to basically emphasize that Start Now button, right? So that's not a technique I'm mentioning here in this lecture, but it's still just another way of drawing attention to that important button. So here are some more examples of de-emphasizing one component in order to emphasize the actual component that we want the user to focus on. Now finally, just like with text elements, you now might be wondering what kinds of components you should actually draw the attention to when you're building your own designs. Well, here I have a big list of some components that we usually want to stand out from the rest of our page's content. And so let's now take a look at an example of each of them. So this is an example of a testimonial, so of someone talking about your own product, basically by trying to advertising it. Then we have call to action sections, which many times websites have like on the end of a page so that the user signs up for their product or their service. Then there are also highlight sections, as I call them, which are essentially big sections in the middle of your content, which we kind of want to stand out. And so we simply can give them, for example, a different background color like this design here does. And here are two more examples of highlight sections. And again, they use some different background color than the rest of the page to really stand out there. Then we also have preview cards, which I had mentioned before already. So basically previewing some kind of product, for example, that you're trying to sell. And so these again, many times should stand out from the rest of the content by using shadow or some kind of border. Then there are also forms, which can look like this, or pricing tables, where many times there are different pricing options, and then the designer usually highlights the one that they actually want the user to choose. So that can be done using a background color, but there are also many other options that you can choose from, as I will show you a little bit later. Because actually, we have an entire big lecture all about different components. And finally, as we already saw a bit earlier, we can also highlight or emphasize an important row or an important column in a table. And of course, this list of examples is not exhaustive. There are many components which can use some emphasizing. All right. But this lecture is already running quite long, and so let's actually implement some of these things in the next lecture. So I see you there after you hopefully finished studying this lecture some more. So let's now analyze and improve the visual hierarchy in our small design project by using white space and also some other techniques that we just learned about. Now this is actually just a very small project, and therefore we're not going to be able to do all of the things that we just learned over the last two lectures, But we can still analyze our visual hierarchy here a little bit, and then, as I mentioned, also try to improve it. So right now, there's already, of course, some hierarchy going on. For example, if you take a look here at this component, so this header here, immediately our attention goes here to this big and bright image, and then probably here to this big heading, and then here to this button, which has this nice background color, which really makes this button here stand out and draws a lot of attention. So a lot of the work on visual hierarchy has already been done actually before, simply by applying many of the other rules. And if we move down here, it's the same. So for example here in this component here, we already made this entire component here stand out a lot by adding this background color. So by having this color, it adds a nice contrast here to the rest of the elements, so these two surrounding sections, and so that draws a lot of attention once again to this more important section here. So again, without even knowing it, we actually already worked a lot on visual hierarchy here. However, there is still a lot to do here, and mostly in the form of white space. So the rules that we learned about white space 2 lectures ago are in many situations here not really applied yet. For example, between the sections, there is not a lot of white space at all. So we have here this heading for this section down here, but the distance between this heading and the content of the section and the previous section, which ends here, is kind of the same. So the distance between this one here and this one is kind of the same. And so this is quite ambiguous spacing. So we don't really know where this heading here belongs to. And the same here, right? This kind of hangs in the middle of these 2 pieces of content. And so that's not good at all. And so remember that one of the very easy guidelines in white space is that we should add a lot or even a ton of white space between sections. All right. So let's go here to our CSS. And so somewhere here we already have some rules about this white space. And so that's right here. So after the header and after the section, there is a margin bottom of 48. So let's check that out here quickly, just so we all know what we're talking about. So we have a header, right? So there's some space there. And then we have the section. And so all of these then have different spacing to the bottom. All right, but now let's actually dramatically increase this. And so, just as we also learned in a lecture about white space, it is a good idea to use a fixed system so that we don't have to constantly choose like random spacing values, right? So we have 48 pixels right now. So all of this here is the spacing system that I mentioned before. And so let's increase that to 80 or even 96. So I'm going to experiment with those 2. So let's say 80 first. Now I need to manually reload this time. And yeah, that looks better already. So here it's really visible that there now is a lot more space here. And now this heading really belongs more to this section. But I think we can actually push it even further to 96 pixels. And this is even better like this. So also there's now a nice space between this section and the footer, and here as well, and here. So that looks definitely a lot better. However, if we now scroll up, then there's a lot of space here below this image, but not here on top of the image. So we should actually add some space here as well. So basically at the top of this header. So let's see where that is. Right here. So there's a margin top of 48. And let's put that to the next value, which was, I think, 64. So 64 or maybe 80. And yeah, 64. So that looks better. Let's try 80, but I think it will be too much. Yeah. So it looks okay like this because our page is actually quite tall, but usually the browser would be a little bit smaller probably, and then this would look maybe not so nice because it wouldn't be vertically centered. So let's put it back to 64, and I think that looks okay. So that is space between sections, which, remember, that's where we want to add a ton of white space. And so now let's take a look at white space between different elements. So here we already also have some white space to establish some hierarchy, because this button here kind of belongs to this block of text, I would say, and so therefore the space here is less than here. However, I think we could add some more space here below this heading to make it stand out even more. So basically, if there's more white space around it, then it will stand out more from the rest of the content. So that's 24 right now, and the next one would be 32. So that's probably good. And again, of course, when you code on your own, you'll have the system maybe somewhere else on your screen, and then you don't have to scroll up and down to see these values all the time. So that's even better now. And so let's move on to the next section. And here again, we have some ambiguous spacing. So the space between the icon and the heading, or this text here, is the same as between this heading and this text. And so that doesn't make a lot of sense, because this text here, this heading, belongs more to this text than to this element. So that's the law of proximity there. Remember that? And so what I'm going to do is to add some more space here to these icons. So here it is. It is at 16 right now, and the same for the features title. And so that's why it kind of sits here in the middle. So let's push that up to the next value, which is 24, as I know by heart. And so that is actually a lot nicer simply by adding 8 pixels of space. And moving on, here we have our next section, and here we can also add some more visual hierarchy between these 3 text elements. So actually there's already some hierarchy going on, with the most important part here bigger and bolder, and then the name of these 2 ladies, Mary and Sarah. This text is already smaller than the testimonial itself, right? However, we can also try to make it a little bit darker. And remember actually that technique that I mentioned way back when we talked about colors, where we can make the color of text inside a bright colors block like this one here, basically adapt to that background color. So what I mean is to basically give this white text here some very, very light green color. And so then the contrast between this bright green here in the background and the white will not be as big, and it will look a little bit more natural. So hopefully you still remember that trick that I mentioned before, but of course you can always go back and check that out. Now, in order to actually get that very light green color, we should go back to open colors where we got that color in the first place. So open color, I don't know if that will be enough, but it is. And anyway, if you didn't find it this way, as always, you can just go to my resources page. But anyway, let's now try out this very first here, so this TL0, which as you see here is really, really light. So the difference will be very subtle, but these small subtle effects can make all the difference if you want to create a very polished looking design. So that would be in the testimonial text, I think. Let's see. Yeah, so that's the one. So let's give it a color that we just copied. And now take a close look here at that text. And, well, it does look almost the same as before, but if you compare it with this one here, then you can notice a subtle difference. And that's going to become even more important because now we will choose another green color for this one here and a darker one. And so then that will create some contrast between these 2 elements and establish a nice visual hierarchy right there. So we need to select this here, testimonial author. We don't have that yet. Can actually double click here and copy that from here. And then let's get here the next color. So this one. And now let's see what happens. And yeah, so here you can actually see that this is quite green already. It's not just as white as it was before. And so this creates now, as I mentioned before, some nice contrast between this text and this one. And so the visual hierarchy is now even better established. And now finally moving on here to our card section with the best-selling chairs, there's also some stuff that we can fix here. Because once again, we have some ambiguous spacing here. So here inside these cards, we have basically three parts. We have the heading, then we have these four bullet points here. So these four pieces of information. And then down here, we have like the rest of the card, which is the price and this button. Now, right now, the space here between all of this is basically all the same. So if you take a look, then the space here between these two pieces of information and this section here in the end is exactly the same. And even here, it looks very similar. And so that doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of visual hierarchy. So we want this block, so this list here basically, to be a bit more separate from the rest of the two pieces of content. So this one and this one. And so probably we should decrease the spacing here a little bit. All right. And actually, before we do that, we should add some more padding as well, because the space here inside of this card is really quite small. So we can push it to the next level, which is 32 pixels. And so this looks a lot better with one simple change of the padding. And so now let's decrease that spacing here between these list items, as I was mentioning. So there's 24 pixels right now. So let's take that down to 16. Right? And so before they looked a little bit detached too, but now, to my eye at least, they look a little bit more related to one another. And now finally, let's also add some more space here between this list and this part down here. So let's see what we're actually looking for here. So it's the chair details and the chair price. So let's go to the chair details and change that here a lot. So here we can maybe push it even to 48 pixels. So yeah, that looks a lot better once again. But not only does it look better, but it also works better. So the design like this makes a lot more sense because the visual hierarchy is now better established. And so it's now easier for the user to figure out what they can do here in this card. Now, there's some alignment problem here that I just noticed. So this chair price here uses Flexbox, but we do not vertically align these, right? So let's quickly do that in the chair price. So let's align items, remember. Set that to center. Nice. So that's fixed now. And I think with this, we are actually done. So if we take a look at our final product, which at this point is actually finished. So we applied all the design rules to this project right now. And so I think that it is a whole lot of difference between what we had in the beginning and what we had now. And all we did was to add a couple of lines of CSS and followed a couple of design guidelines that I have been showing you throughout this section. And once more, I want to emphasize just how big of a difference all these small changes together can make. So each of these individual adjustments that we did over time here maybe might have seemed a little bit unnecessary or too much, but if we add everything together, then all these small details make all of the difference. And so we end up with a nice design that makes sense and is easy to use. So hopefully you can take that as one of the main takeaways from this section as you start creating your own designs. But anyway, this project here is now finished, but there's actually still some more things to learn in this web design section. And so let's go now to the next lecture, which is all about user experience. Next lecture. And in this one, I want to give you a quick introduction to the field of user experience design, or UX design for short. And I say introduction because UX design is actually a huge field, with many designers actually being specialized UX designers. And so in this lecture, we will really just scratch the surface of UX design. But still, I believe that all web designers should at least have some idea of what UX is actually all about, why it's important, and of course also how we can improve the user experience of our interfaces. And to start, let's try to understand what user experience actually means. And to do that, we can use a very popular quote by Steve Jobs, which is, "Design is not just what it looks and feels like, but design is how it works." So here, the what it looks and feels like is basically what the user interface is all about. So the user interface is basically the visual presentation of any digital product. And so therefore, it's all about the layout of the design, as well as the typography, colors, icons, and other design elements that we use. And in the end, it's also about the overall personality. So kind of a feel and a vibe that we give to our design. So that is what the part of looks like and feels like is all about. It's about the user interface. But then Steve Jobs actually said that design is how it works. And so that how it works is what refers to the user experience. So in a nutshell, user experience is simply the experience that a user has while they interact with a product. And so when we think about and design the user experience of a product, we ask questions like, does the application feel logical and well thought out? Or does the navigation of this app work intuitively? Or even questions like, are users actually reaching the goals that they wanted to achieve by using this product? And of course, that again only really scratches the surface. There is a lot more to do when we think about and when we design the UX. And speaking about design, let's now talk a little bit more about user interface and user experience design. So, as designers, we can of course design both the user interface and the user experience. So, if UI means the user interface, then UI design is essentially what makes an interface beautiful. And in the same vein, if UX is the user experience, then UX design is what makes an interface useful and functional. That makes sense, right? And so this is what this lecture is all about. It's about learning some rules to design interfaces that are easy for your users to use. Now there is this strange analogy of UI versus UX, where the UI is supposed to be this glass ketchup bottle, which is aesthetically pleasing, but doesn't really work in many situations. On the other hand, UX is supposed to be represented by the newer plastic bottle that is easy to squeeze. So the one that is easier to use. However, if we actually think about this analogy doesn't make a lot of sense. Because in reality, both of these bottles can actually be called a user interface, because they're both interfaces for the user to get some ketchup, right? They do, however, create completely different experiences. And I'm sure that you too have experienced this kind of situation here at some point in your life when you used this kind of ketchup bottle. And also, you might have felt how easy it is to just squeeze the plastic bottle. So, again, both are actually a kind of user interfaces, but they do create completely different experiences. One is more pleasing and the other one is many times a lot more frustrating. But I think that this is actually a nice example of how different user interfaces can create completely different experiences for the user. But anyway, comparing UI design and UX design like this, so by comparing these two bottles and saying that one is UI and the other one is UX, doesn't make a lot of sense anyway, because UI design is actually already a big part of UX design. Or in other words, UX design can really not exist without UI design, because a well-designed user interface is already contributing a lot to a good experience for the user. And in fact, many of the things that we have talked about in earlier lectures are actually also part of creating a good user experience. So again, it's not just about visual design, but really creating an experience which has both the user interface in mind and the experience for the user. And so here again, you can see that UX and UI are really deeply intertwined. And so it's actually quite hard to separate these two topics completely. Now, when we think about and design the user experience of a product, it's always all about goals. So a website or an application exists for a certain reason. So a user has a certain goal for visiting a page, and the business has a certain goal for creating that page in the first place. Because if neither the user or the business would have a certain goal, then there wouldn't be the need for that page to actually exist in the first place, right? And usually the goal of the user is to simply use a certain product, to find some information, or to buy some product, while many times the goal of the business is to sell something, no matter if it's an actual product or simply selling advertisements. And this is extremely important because basically all that UX design is for is to align the user's goals with the business goals. Or in other words, the goal of UX design is to fulfill both the goals of the user and the business. So as an example, let's say that the goal of a certain user is to design websites faster, and the goal of some other business is to sell design kits for design tools such as Sketch or Figma. And so here, good user experience design will design a product that makes it really easy to both the user and the business to fulfill their goals. So in this case, to create a transaction between the business selling some design kits so that the user can design their websites faster. Now, one extremely common example that you will see all the time is to highlight one option in a pricing table like this. And the designer does that because it makes it easier for the user to decide which is the best option to choose, and on the other hand, it helps the business maximize their revenue, because usually the option that is highlighted is the most expensive one, or also the one that they know will sell the best and make them the most money. So again, here the user has the goal of quickly deciding which is the best option, while the business, of course, has the goal of maximizing revenue. And so here the user's goals seem to be aligned with the business goals. So this, I would say, is good UX design. And finally, another UX example that many companies use to maximize revenue is to use a pop-up form in order to capture users' email addresses. Now, this does help the business's goal, but in many cases, it actually makes for a really bad and annoying user experience. And it many times also doesn't help the user reach his goal. And so in this case, the goals are very clearly not aligned. Now, this doesn't mean that you can never use pop-ups, but you have to be aware that it's actually not good UX design. And like this, there are, of course, countless other examples of bad UX design, such as hiding a button to cancel a subscription on some page that is almost impossible to find. But anyway, I think this is enough theory on UX and UX design, and so let's now go over some practical UX guidelines that had no real place in previous lectures. And the very first one is that you should not create overcomplicated layouts. So there is no need to reinvent the wheel like this, for example. Instead, you should use patterns that users are already familiar with instead of trying to be original. So there's absolutely no need to be original because creativity is quite overrated in web design. Now, creativity might be important for the top 1% websites or if you want to win some award, but the everyday designer like you and me should simply use patterns that are used on most of the websites out there. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with using well-established patterns. Because remember, a website exists because users want to reach a goal. And so if a page looks familiar, it will help the user navigate the page faster. And therefore, they will reach their goal faster as well. Now, as a result of this, many websites do look the same or quite the same, but again, there's actually not really anything wrong with that. So familiarity with your layout is way more important than being original. Okay, never forget that. Next up, always make your call to action, which is usually a button, the most prominent element on the screen. Here, for example, the reserve button is quite difficult to find, and so this will create a frustrating experience for your user. On the other hand, here of course, it is pretty clear how you can reserve a booking. So all you have to do is to click this button. It is really clear because the button really stands out. It's really prominent. And so that's basically also what we learned in the lecture about visual hierarchy, right? Also, make sure that the button describes exactly what will happen when the user clicks it, because this will, once again, make sure that your users can reach the goal faster and more easily. Now, the next rule is a very simple one, which is that you should use blue text and underline text only for links. So that's super important because users are so used to the pattern that links are blue or underlined like this, that you will really confuse them if you ever use underlined or blue text anywhere that is not a link. So in this second example, that blue and underlined United States text there very clearly looks like a link to you as well, right? But, well, here it is actually not a link. And so this is very confusing and frustrating, and so don't do that. Next up, if you use animations in your design, make sure that they actually have a purpose and that they are fast. So don't use animations just because you can, because that might leave users confused, and many times it simply doesn't look professional. Also, make sure that your animations are fast, like between 200 and 500 milliseconds, because otherwise your users will perceive the interface as being slow and sluggish. So no one wants to wait for some animation to finish, right? Just take a look at this image here fading in for 2 whole seconds. That looked really sluggish, right? Like not professional. On the other hand, the next animation only takes 0.4 seconds, and that looks just right, if you ask me. So follow this rule whenever you do want to place animations in your design. Next up, when you design a form, it should be very easy to scan. And so in order to do that, you should align your labels and fields in one single vertical line, just in this example here. And another one about forms is that you should always offer good feedback for all the actions. So whatever happens after a form is submitted should clearly be stated in your interface, because otherwise that might be very frustrating. So for example, if this form here would successfully send an email, the user would expect to know that by the end, right? So you should display some kind of banner saying that your email has been sent. You should not just leave your user hanging and wondering if the email was actually sent successfully or not. And the final rule for usability of your interface is more about web applications, which is the law of locality. And what the law of locality says is that basically whenever you have a button for a certain action in your user interface, you should place that button wherever that will actually create an effect. So in this example here, which is a simple to-do list, a new task will be added to the end of this list. And so therefore, that is where the Add Task button is actually located. So this is what good UX for an action in a web application looks like, while bad UX design would be something like this. So having a button in a completely random place, which would then create an effect that is completely detached from the button's location. Now, of course, this doesn't really apply to the typical call to action buttons that we have on something like marketing websites, but I still find it important to mention these rules here anyway. Now, if you want to know even more like these, then please just let me know in the Q&A area of this video. But now we're actually quickly going to move on to some UX rules for the actual content of a website. And that's super important because the actual content is yet another area that really influences the way that users use your website. And so therefore, we really need a couple of rules for creating content that creates a good user experience. And first of all, what you should do is to write a very descriptive headline on your main page, which focuses on the keywords that best describe what your business actually does. So as always, here are a couple of examples of that. And if you read through these headlines, you will see that they actually really tell you what the business is all about, all in one sentence. Now, many websites are actually way too vague or even too fancy here. And so please don't do anything like this. So for example, if you just read the headline of this website, which says, "Join the solar energy revolution," well, what would that business really be about? So again, the main headline of the website should really convey what the business does or what the website is all about. Because once more, this will help your users reach their goal faster. Because how can they reach their goal if they are not even sure what the website is all about or what the business even does? Now, when you're actually deciding about the content of your website, make sure to only include relevant information and also to present it in an efficient way. So cut out all the fluff that you don't really need, like irrelevant images, text, illustrations, buttons, and so on and so forth. So everything that makes it onto the page should have a very clear purpose. And these two websites here actually do that really well. So you can pause the video and check them out if you'd like. Now, the reason why this is so important is that every time that we add an additional piece of content to the page, it will compete with all the other information that might be actually more relevant. And so in order to help your user understand what the product or the service is all about, make the content 100% clear and relevant. Now, this doesn't mean that your website needs to be like super minimal and completely stripped down to the bare essentials. But just make sure that you don't include any fluff content that doesn't really add to the overall message that you're trying to convey. And following the same line, you should also use simple words for the actual text. Everyone prefers to read text that is simple, so avoid complicated and smart-sounding words, and even more importantly, avoid technical jargon that might be relevant in your particular industry, but that your users might not even know about. So some people think that doing this makes them sound smart or knowledgeable in their field, but really what it does is to confuse your users, and you don't want that. And now, finally, because I know that you're probably tired of listening to me, so the last one is that if you have a long text then make sure to break up that long wall of text using subheadings, images, block quotes, bullet points, and other things like that. And doing this is important because it will make the text actually look more interesting to read. If the user sees just one big wall of text, you can be pretty sure that they are going to just skip it. But if you do something like you see here on the right side, then that looks way more interesting. And so I believe that there will be a way higher user retention on this content. Okay, and that's actually it for this lecture. I hope that you found it useful and that you learned a couple of things, and especially new things about this huge field of UX design. Again, we really just scratched the surface here, but this should be enough for a new aspiring web designer like you. We're finally going to talk about website personalities while I introduce what I call the website personalities framework that I created specifically for this course. So remember how I explained right in the first lecture of this section how I took hundreds, if not thousands, of well-designed websites and deconstructed them and distilled them into countless web design rules, which are the ones that we just learned throughout all this section. Now, what I also did was to distill all these websites that I analyzed into 7 different website personalities. And this will help you a lot when you will have to take your own design decisions in the future, because the web design rules that we learned before will have to be applied according to the personality that you chose for your design. And so, therefore, once you have a personality chosen, your design choices are going to be a lot more limited, which will actually make it a lot easier for you to create a consistent and good-looking design on your own. So, let's now see how the process of choosing the personality actually works. But first of all, what is a website personality? Well, in this framework that I created, a website personality is basically like a general feeling or a vibe that we want the website to transmit to our users. And it's also a feeling that we want to invoke in our users. So, for example, if we choose the serious personality, we want the user to feel luxury or sophistication or the sense of a premium product. So, when it comes to choosing the right personality for your design, think about what I just mentioned. So, think about how do you want your website to appear to your users? What vibe do you want to transmit? Then, based on that, you look at the list of personalities and choose the one that best fits the vibe that you want to convey. Or, if that's easier for you, you can of course also directly choose one of the 7 personalities directly from this list. Also, you can choose multiple personalities if you want, but more on that by the end of this video. But now you might ask, why is this personality actually so important? Why does it matter? Well, the answer is that it will make web design like 10 times easier for you. Because once you have a personality selected, your design options for each of the design ingredients becomes really limited. Because just like personalities in people have different traits, each of these website personalities also have different traits as well. For example, the serious and elegant personality doesn't use shadows and doesn't use border radius, while the startup and upbeat personality uses these all the time. Therefore, when we create our designs, all we have to do is to apply these personality traits for each of the design ingredients that we learned about. And what exactly are these personality traits? Well, let's find out. So we're going to start with the serious and elegant personality. And here in the beginning is again that overview text that I already showed you in the first lecture of this section, and so I'm not going to read those again for each of these personalities. And in fact, I'm only briefly going to talk about each of the personalities, because otherwise it gets very boring for you quickly. So what I want you to do is once again to actually download these slides and then study all of these personality traits basically by yourself and take a look at the examples to see that what I'm explaining here really makes sense in the context of each personality. But anyway, the serious or elegant personality is used a lot in real estate or fashion and in general luxury products or services. And so here now we have the web design ingredients that we had learned about before, right? So typography, colors, images, icons, shadows, border radius, and also layout, which we will talk about in the next section. So again, for each of these personalities, we now have basically different personality traits in each of these ingredients. So the serious personality uses serif typefaces, and especially in headings, a light font weight, and usually a small body font size is also quite common. Common colors include gold, pastel colors like in this example, or black, or dark blue, or gray. So basically colors that invoke some kind of luxury or high quality products. As for the images, these types of designs use very big images many times and also make sure that these are really high quality images. So many times they hire professional photographers to really create awesome pictures and photos for their designs. Now about icons, many times the serious designs do not use any icons at all, but sometimes thin icons and lines can be used. Then shadows and border radius are usually not used, as we also mentioned before actually, and a creative and experimental layout is quite common for these designs to use. Now, of course, not all of these are always present in all the serious and elegant designs. So this is more of a rough guideline and a collection of trends that you can use in your own designs because, again, it will make it a lot easier for you to do that. So not all of the websites that you will see fit into these 7 personalities, but to make it easier for you as a beginner, I think this is a great framework that will really help you. But now let's take a look at some more examples of this personality. So here you have 3 more sites, which all of them kind of roughly follow the guidelines that I mentioned exactly for this website personality. And again, I want you to look at these examples by yourself with some time, maybe after the video, or you can also, of course, pause the video and analyze yourself. Next up, we have the minimalist or simple personality, which is used commonly for fashion or portfolios of any kind, or even some kind of minimalism company like this Arc Shelter example that I have here on the right side. So typography is usually very boxy and squared and uses sans serif typefaces. As for colors, usually it is simply black text on a white background because that conveys a very minimalist image. And it's also usual that only one color is used throughout the entire design. And usually these designs use few images and no illustrations, and especially no 3D illustrations. That would just look very strange in these kinds of websites. Also, there are usually no icons, but sometimes some smaller or simple black icons can be used. Also, again, there are no shadows and no border radius in this kind of design, and the layout is usually very simple. Sometimes it's actually just a narrow 1-column layout with all the content one after another. Now let's look at a couple of more examples here. So in this first one here, for example, we do have some high quality images which adds some nice colors to the design, which is otherwise just completely black and white, as I mentioned. There are also some small black icons, and again, just like I showed you in the previous slide. Then the second one here does actually use illustrations, but they are very simple 2D illustrations, and everything is in complete black and white. And then the last one here is actually an exception to the rule of serif typefaces. So the bigger headings are actually using a thin serif typeface, but the overall design still looks quite minimalist. Next up, we have the plain or neutral personality. And so this is used in well-established corporations. So companies that don't necessarily want to make a huge impact through their design. And examples of that are like this IBM website or the Microsoft website that I showed you at the very beginning. So here typography is very neutral looking and usually using sans serif typefaces. As for the colors, these are usually kind of safe, as we can say. So they're not like too bright or too washed out or not crazy looking at all. And blues and blacks are very common because, as we learned in the colors lecture, blue is the kind of color that conveys trust. And so that's simply what these big brands or these big corporations are looking for. Now, images are quite frequent in these designs, but usually in a very small format, so they don't take a center stage like they do in other website personalities. Now, some simple icons can sometimes be used, but again, there is no shadow and no border radius usually. Finally, about the layout, these kinds of websites usually all have a very structured and condensed layout. So there are a lot of boxes and rows, just like we can see here on the right side. So this is really a very typical looking plain or neutral design. So overall, as a summary of this personality, we can just say that the goal is to not make a big visual impact. They almost try to be boring, it seems like. Now that doesn't mean that the design is bad. Alright, so bad is very different from boring. So of course, these big corporations have big budgets for designers. So they are not bad, and the design is not bad. It simply serves their goal to have a design like this. So 3 more here, and again we have Microsoft, we have Porsche here, and then this other website right here. And so if you compare this with the personality traits that I just mentioned, then you will hopefully find that all of these 3 are some neutral looking designs. Next up, we have the very important bold and confident personality trait, which is one of the ones that I really like. And it is used a lot in digital agencies, software startups, travel companies, in general, companies that want to transmit a strong image so that they are confident in themselves and are not afraid to make some bold moves. Now, one of the most distinguishing factors of bold designs is the boxy square typefaces, which are usually used using big and bold typography. Also, just as we can see in this example, big color blocks or big sections with a bright colored background are usually used to draw a lot of attention. And both these personality traits clearly display the boldness and the confidence of these designs. And the same thing is done by using lots of big images as well. Now, as for icons, shadows, and border radius, these are usually not used in these types of designs or are used very sparingly. So, for example, that button that you have here, which says Shop Our Kids, it actually has a very small border radius. But in general, what I mean here is that these designs are usually not round at all. And here are 3 more design examples. And once again, we can see how the big typography paired with the very confident use of some big and bright color blocks really kind of transmits the boldness and the confidence of these brands. So that is exactly the goal of using this website personality. Next up, there is the calm or peaceful personality, and this is basically the complete opposite of the boldness and confident personality that we just talked about. Now, this one is used a lot in healthcare and in general in products that have a big focus or which actually have the main focus on consumer well-being. So this one is basically for brands that want to transmit to the user that they care about them a lot. And they do this by using soft serif typefaces and especially for headings, like these two that we can see here. And also, it is very common to use these washed out colors, like these blue or yellow pastel colors, or also light oranges or browns or greens. So you will see these all the time, and also in the three examples that I will show you next. Then the images very frequently feature a lot of people, and they also try to match the calmer color palettes that are employed. So, of course, it would be weird to all of a sudden have an image here which has very bright and flashy colors like we see in the bold personality. Now, this calm personality finally uses some icons and border radius a lot. So now we start seeing more rounded designs here at this point. Shadows, however, are not used a lot, but sometimes, of course, you will see them. And as for layouts, there are no particular tendencies. So no particularly strange or creative layouts are used. So 3 more examples, and these are actually quite common and quite easy to find these days. So this is right now a very popular website personality because more and more brands are trying to transmit that image that they care about the consumer. And so in all these 3 designs, you can see these calming pastel colors, you can see the soft serif typefaces in the headlines, and also the messaging itself, so the text content, is also all about the consumer, and it is very focused on basically helping them and caring about them. Next up, we have finally the startup or the upbeat personality. And if you use a lot of technology websites like I do, then this is probably the personality that you come across the most. So, as the name of the personality says, this one is used a lot in software startups, but also in other companies that simply want to transmit a modern looking image to their customers. So this design right here is from the Stripe website, which is a very big and well-known software startup. And many people actually try or get inspired by this exact design, so by this website right here. But now about the personality traits, let's again start with typography. And this personality uses medium-sized headings and usually only one sans serif typeface in the entire design. And the tendency is for light colors in the text, which is quite a modern looking trend in these kinds of websites. Now, about the colors, greens and blues and purples are used a lot for the primary brand colors. And then as for background colors, it is very common to have a light gray background in many places in these designs. And again, we can see that right away here in this example on the right side. It's also quite common to use gradients, at least in the last couple of years. These have become really popular. Now, images are of course used all the times, and illustrations, and especially 3D illustrations, are becoming really modern these days. So you will see illustrations all the times in startup or upbeat websites, and sometimes even patterns or these small shapes that might add some visual details, for example, behind images. And I think I showed you that in one of the lectures before. Also, icons and shadows and border radius are all used very commonly. So these designs are again getting more round as all the other previous designs that we talked about, and shadow is also more used than before. Now, about some common layout patterns, it is quite usually to see something like rows of cards or rows of product features and the Z pattern in startup designs. And we will learn what those actually are very soon by the beginning of the next section. And now again, 3 more examples, and you can see in all of them that they use a very simple and clean looking typography. So the text is not too big and the colors are also quite light. And actually in the first example, I would even say they are a little bit too light. Also, you can see these light gray background colors used all the time, especially in the first 2. But in the last one, basically we have the same thing, but in a dark mode design. So these three examples really tick all the boxes of a modern startup and upbeat design, which, again, I'm sure you have seen this kind of design all over the place these days, because it is by far one of the most popular ones that we see these days. So I would say this one and the calm personality are the most common ones. And now, finally, personality number 7 is the playful and fun personality. So designs that employ this personality are usually for companies related to products for children or for animals, or many times also for food, actually. Now here the typography is usually very round and creative. So many times actually some variation of handwritten fonts are used, and sans serif typefaces are actually quite common. Now, one of the most distinguishing features of this personality is the very frequent use of color in this design. So using a lot of color all over the place, like in backgrounds or in the text or even inside of images, is what gives these designs the very playful and fun vibe. Of course, a lot of images are also used, and sometimes even like hand-drawn illustrations. So again, these help giving these designs their playful vibe. And the same thing is true for icons and shadows and border radius. So again, all of these are very common and are used all the times, and many times even in a hand-drawn style, especially for the icons. Now here we have 3 more examples which are maybe a little bit less playful than the one that we just saw, but still I think that these 3 ones, especially thanks to their use in color and some hand-drawn elements, can be classified as a playful and fun personalities. So again, hopefully these serve as an inspiration for you, and yeah, I hope you can check out all of these designs here with a little bit more time, analyze what's going on in them, and really see how they compare with the traits that I just described. Now, you can actually finish the lecture at this point without any problem, because at this point we talked about everything that is most important in the website personality framework that I invented basically for this course. So what we just learned is the most important thing that you should know, but if you want to dig even deeper into design and into this website personality framework, then let's keep going. So what I want to show you now is that we can basically place all these 7 personalities into this axis of serious playfulness or calmness and boldness. So basically, serious is the opposite of playful, and calm is the opposite of bold in basically this framework. And so here we're now going to learn that we can actually combine playfulness and boldness in one single design. So playful basically means, as we just learned, that the design is more colorful and everything is more rounded, and there are more shadows and illustrations in general. Now, placing these personalities into the playfulness, the first one needs to be the serious or elegant personality. So this one is the one that is the least playful. So it is the most serious one. Then there is the minimalist one, then the plain and neutral personality, then the startup and upbeat, which is already quite playful. But then, of course, the most playful one is, in fact, the playful and fun personality, right? So this is basically these 5 personalities ordered from the most serious one to the most playful one. Then there's also the boldness axis. And so as we learned, the bolder the website design is, the more boxy and squared the typefaces are, and the bigger and bolder the typography is going to be. And the colors will also be, let's say, brighter or more flashier in bigger blocks of color. And the boldest personality is, of course, the bold and confident personality. Then, on the other hand of the spectrum, we have, of course, the calm and peaceful personality. And as we also learned, the calmer the design is, the more the headings use soft serif typefaces and these washed out colors and illustrations. But now you might be wondering why all of this actually matters and why I'm showing you all this. Well, the reason is that this can basically show us that all these personalities are actually fluid and can be placed inside of the spectrum of playfulness and boldness, which means that some trait of the boldness or the calm personalities can basically get injected into one of the other 5 personalities. So let's consider the startup personality. Sometimes this kind of design wants to appear also a little bit bolder or more confident. And so then they can simply take some of the personality traits of the bold or of the confident website personality and use them in their own personality as well. Or of course, it can also go the other way. So the startup personality might want to appear a little bit more caring about the consumer. And so in that case, it can try to embed some of the character traits of the calm personality inside of its own designs. All right? And so basically what I want to show you here is that some boldness or some calmness can get injected into these other 5 website personalities. All right? Now, the other personalities can actually also get mixed. For example, you could mix the serious personality with the startup one, but that is actually a lot less common. So these days, it's mostly boldness and calmness that gets embedded into one of the other personalities. And sometimes even boldness and calmness can be mixed, which can make for some very interesting designs, but that is actually a bit more difficult for beginners to pull off. All right. And to illustrate all this, let's again take a look at a couple of examples. And this first one here is what I would classify basically as the base personality, as a minimalist and simple design. However, this design then does use some big and bold typography and also has these 2 big colored blocks. They're not really that bright or flashy, but still they kind of are part of the bold personality. And so here I would say that some boldness got injected into the minimalist or simple main personality. Then another one, and here I would say that this is kind of a startup personality, but then again it got injected with some boldness, as we can see with this very big and boxy typeface. And yeah, the typography in general is very bold and big as well. And in this one, we can actually even see some hints of minimalism. So the design is mostly black and white with some blue links, and there are no icons or shadows or illustrations here at all. But anyway, let's take a look at another one. And this one is mostly bold, I would say. So there are a lot of bright colors. The typography is quite big as well. But then we have these irregular and round design elements, and also the hand-drawn icons and this pattern here behind the image. And so there is clearly some playfulness going on in this design. Maybe we could even say that playfulness is the main personality and boldness the secondary, so to say, but that's not really relevant anyway. What matters is that here we have kind of a fusion between these two, and it makes for a really nice looking and creative design. Then here we have another bold or confident personality, I would say. So the headings are huge and there's a lot of bright color blocks. I mean, here you can only see one of them, but the rest of the website, as I saw it, actually had a lot of those. But then there is actually some calm or some peaceful personality traits injected into it, and especially in these soft serif typefaces in the headings, and also in these calming pastel colors that are used throughout the illustrations of the entire site. So this is the situation that I mentioned, where actually even the calmness and boldness can be mixed in one design. And I think this works really, really nice in this situation actually, but again, it might be a little bit harder to actually create this type of design. Then just 2 more. Here we have a startup or upbeat personality with some calm traits inside of it. And many times the calmness trait that gets injected is usually these soft serif typefaces in the headings. So that is actually a big trend that I've been observing in all kinds of designs these days, and the same actually for these calming illustrations. So these two character traits of calmness are these days injected into all other kinds of personalities. And actually here I have another example of that. So here again, the exact same two things have been injected right into this design, which works really nice for the reason that I mentioned before. So for the fact that this kind of shows the user of the site that this company actually cares for them. So using these traits really makes the user feel that this is not just some cold and faceless company. Somehow these design choices makes the user feel more secure and more trusting also in a way. And so these companies are taking advantage of that using these design decisions. All right, and that's actually it. That is my website's personalities framework, and I hope it made sense to you, and I hope that you might use it at some point when you create your own designs. And of course, we will use it when we create our big OmniFood project a little bit later in this course. So again, I hope you learned something here and that it was interesting. And I see you now in the next video where we will finally finish up this section and talk about getting inspiration. So another important ingredient when you need to come up with your own designs completely on your own. So see you there. To coming up with great designs. And my answer is always the same. It is not a secret at all. All I do is to copy what I like from other great designs. And this is what's called stealing like an artist. And so let's now take 5 quick minutes to see how I do it. So, of course, when we want to come up with a certain design, we still need to care about all the things that we talked about up until this point. So things like choosing a website personality and thinking about all the different design ingredients by using the guidelines and the rules that we learned for each of them. And all of that is great and really, really important and essential, but there is still something missing. And that missing piece, as I mentioned right in the beginning of this lecture, is basically to get inspired and to steal like an artist. Now, what do I mean by stealing like an artist? Well, basically stealing like an artist means that we do not completely copy a certain design. So what we do instead is that we take the good parts of one or usually many good designs that we like and then simply adapt them to our needs while using again all of the different rules and guidelines that we already learned before and that we will actually keep learning a little bit in the next section. So, getting a lot of inspiration from other well-designed sites is really, really important if you want to create your own design. And so let me show you now how I do that. So I like to use a couple of aggregator sites which feature a lot of great designs all the time. And my most important sources of inspiration are landbook.com, One Page Love, and then here in this inspiration tab, then awards.com, which is a very well-known site which basically gives other sites awards for their design and creativity and innovation. So here we can go to the collections, and then from here we can choose websites. But of course, as always, all of these 4 websites that I use will be on my resources page along with some other ones. And then I also use screenlane.com for individual components. So let's quickly see a little bit how they work, and let's pretend that we want to design some kind of website for a startup for which we have been hired. So we already know that we want to use the startup and upbeat personality, and we also know already how we should actually apply each of the design ingredients according to that personality. But now, of course, we need to get some inspiration. And so again, that's where these inspiration sites come into play. So since we're looking for startup pages, let's kind of look for those here in these websites. So this one here looks like a startup page. So we can right click here, open in a new tab, and then we can keep going. So this is basically an endless feed of very well designed pages that is being updated all the time. So this one, for example, was added 4 days ago, and yeah, all the time they keep adding new and new and new designs all the time. Of course, your site will look different here by the time you're watching the video. Maybe the entire site looks different as well, or might not even exist anymore. But the main point is, of course, that we need to get some inspiration from them. And if it's not Landbook, then it might be One Page Love or some other one that I will have on my resources page. But anyway, this one here looks like a calm personality. This one here maybe as well, together maybe with some minimalism in there. I'm not sure. So of course it needs a bit more time to analyze. But yeah, what matters is that you can keep going here and get all the inspiration that you want. This one clearly looks like a startup page. So let's open this one. And yeah, I think that's enough. Let's go to another one here. But of course, typically I would spend a lot of time here on each of these pages and open maybe 20, 30, 50, if necessary, other websites to get inspiration. So this one here might be another startup. So now here we have the link to the page down here. This one here looks like a startup as well. Okay, let's just move it to the side. Then here actually we have a lot of different types of designs. The ones we find on awards are a lot more creative and experimental. So it's a bit harder to find what we're looking for, but when we find it, then the quality of design is many times superior right here. And actually we can also filter these, I think. Here, popular, and here is even a tag just for startups alone. So here is another one. And yeah, so the point here is just so you see how this works. So let's take a look at a couple of sites. All right, so I like this header component here. This one here also looks interesting. I never saw something like this actually. That's quite creative. All right, but in general, there's not a lot of really creative stuff here. Okay, but again, this is just to get some general inspiration and like a general mindset of what is being used right now in design. So maybe you might not even take anything specific from any of the pages, but what matters is more that you kind of get your mind into a certain mindset, so a certain state in which after you've seen 100 designs, it will get a lot easier for you to then build your own. So trust me, I have experienced that a lot of times actually. So even if you don't need to copy anything specific, it will still help you to take a look at many, many different designs. And in fact, the best thing would even be to get into the habit of looking for designs, even if you do not need it at that particular moment. So for example, every month I might take half an hour and come to these websites to look what's new or what's happening in design right now. So I try to get inspiration every single month, even though I'm not always designing new pages. But I still want to know what's happening and I want to get a feeling for design basically all the time. But anyway, let's keep going here. And once you look at so many pages, you will see many patterns emerge. And actually, that is exactly what we will talk about in the beginning of the next section. So this here is like a feature row where you have an icon, a heading, some text, and a link. And on the other side, you have some kind of image. So this is a component which is then being repeated here. And so this repetition here is what we called a pattern. So an F pattern in this case. But more about that in the next section again, because this one is really more about how to get inspiration, not really what these components here are all about. So you can then take a look here at different pages, because many times there are actually more interesting details or more interesting components hidden in one of these other pages, not necessarily in the starting page. So I like to look for the pricing page, for example, which usually has these testimonials, it has these features, and yeah, as I was expecting, it has some frequently asked questions as well. So again, you will start noticing these patterns, and well, we don't really need to go through these pages here right now, because I think you get the point, right? So again, you do not even need to take anything in particular from one of the pages. Sometimes all you need to do is to simply scan a lot of pages, because that will then get into your mind, and once you then start to design, you will kind of be in the right frame of mind to create these designs by yourself. All right, and in the next section, we will learn how that actually works a bit more in practice. So this section has been quite theoretical with all these design guidelines, but in the next section,